Hi there, I'm Serging with So and I have kind of a unique little short project that I want to share with you. I've had this stretch lace in my stash for quite a while now, and I didn't think I'd bought enough to do what I'd wanted to do with it. And now I realize what I can do is I'm just going to use my scoop neck t-shirt pattern that I made and make kind of a longish lace nightie. And I think this is going to be the perfect project. I'm going to use the decorative border here as the hem, and it's just going to be like a simple scoop neck tee with cap sleeves that I can sew up pretty easily on my serger or using a zigzag. Interestingly, the stretch on this fabric goes along the length grain, the greater stretch. There is stretch going both ways, but the greater amount is on the length grain, which is kind of interesting, and it makes it able for me to use the hem as the scallop lace edge here. So it's going to be perfect. So here's my plan. I'm going to take my little scoop neck tee. I have a video on this, but I used the Moneta dress by Colette Patterns to make it. And I think any scoop tee net or whatever t-shirt you want to use, as long as it's kind of body skimming or however you want it to fit, can work. And I'm going to lengthen it just below kind of my butt. So kind of my really low hip. And if you had enough, you could even make matching underwear, and I think that would be really awesome. So my plan is to open this up, the fabric, and I'm going to make it so that this is about 30 inches long from the shoulder. What I did was I just took a tape measure and I draped it over my shoulder and kind of figured out where I wanted the length. And the reason I did it this way was because sometimes that shoulder seam can be really low, it can be really high, and just measuring from there to your length may be an inch or two different than what you're wanting. And if it's something kind of that you want a specific length, what I would do is just find your total length from hem to hem over your shoulder and then measure your pattern and do the same thing. That way you get the right length that you want. And I'm going to cut one on one side of this long edge. So I'm going to cut one on this end, and then I'm going to cut the other one on the other end, the other selvage, and then that will allow for me to get a scoop neck or a cap sleeve on either piece of the border that I'm not cutting on, and then I can have my cap sleeve have the little scalloped hem as well. All right, let's do it. Now I'm going to make my hip just a little bit wider down at the bottom. I actually don't want it to cling. I just want it to kind of just graze the body. So. I'm going to use the other one to determine the side seam length and the width of it as well. I'm going to put a clip to denote that this is my front, but it'll be pretty obvious to me because the neck is taller for the back. I don't really want to notch my lace, mainly because it's going to be kind of a narrow seam allowance, and I'm just going to protect the edge as much as possible. It's not particularly incredibly fragile, but I still think that that's just kind of a prudent move. All right, so now we're left with these two opposite borders that we can get our sleeves on. So make sure you cut a left and a right. Okay, we're ready to sew this together. I'm going to probably use my serger to sew it together for the most part, so it's nice and quick, just a 3-thread serger. And I'm considering even hand sewing the hems. I'm going to do a rolled hem. You could bind it. You could maybe use a decorative stitch. Maybe your serger even does some sort of decorative edging that you can apply. Even using the differential and making the differential stretched out, and you might get a little ruffled edge on certain fabrics. I would test it on a swatch first. That gives a lettuce edging, like the edge of lettuce, you know, the vegetable. So that's kind of a nice little effect. There's only shoulders and side seams and armholes. It's going to be a pretty quick sew. So I would just be creative on that scoop neckline if you like, or V-neck, whatever you plan on doing. All right, let's do it. Okay, so I'm just gonna 3-thread serge these pieces, and I've already done a little test here. I have 3 threads in, and I never get to use this thread color, so that's kind of great. And it still stretches. I couldn't find any clear elastic or something similar for my shoulder seams, but it's not a top that's going to get a lot of use because it's kind of delicate. And I'll just probably be gentle with it. And if I ever find it needs more stability, I can always add it later. All right, let's do it. Okay, so first we're going to do the shoulders. I'm using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So now we're going to do the side seams, and then we're going to do our sleeves. So I kind of want to start from the bottom so that I know that my scalloped hem is going to match the seam allowance. So you can see down here, I'll probably make sure that I press this little seam allowance. And it looks like I need to press this weird little scallop here that wants to roll in on itself. But I'll probably press the seam allowance one direction towards the back and stitch it down so that it's not hanging below. But since it's such a narrow seam allowance, it's probably not a big deal either. I also like to clip this, tighten it up, and then I'll stitch this down into the seam allowance as well, so that's nice and clean and not hanging out. So remember, always line it up on the seam line. And if you were more artful than I was, matching up your scallops so they were continuous, that's a nice touch. All right, so let's do the underarms of our sleeves. I forgot to lop off the hem allowance of this sleeve, so my sleeve's gonna be a little longer than usual, and so that's why I trimmed off that little edge there, that little hem allowance, so that's a straight side seam. Okay, so I'm going to put this in so I can keep my sleeve, keep track of which sleeve is which as far as left and right and where the front goes. All right, so here we go. Start at the bottom. Knits generally don't have a lot of easing in set-in sleeves. They're pretty easy. Line up my shoulder. Press the seams towards the back. I like to overlock a little bit without my blade touching the existing serging stitches. And I'll leave that, and I'll stitch this down as well with a single needle machine, just right in the seam allowance. I'll have to trim off that hem allowance as well. I'm going to try and match up these scallops a little better as well. That way it looks a little more continuous of a scallop edge. This is not great, but it'll do. Sometimes on bulkier underarm seams, what I like to do is press the sleeve underarm seam towards the front and the side seam towards the back, just to kind of leave the thickness right here at the underarm. You probably see me lifting up my presser foot a little bit, and that's just to kind of get the work under there. Because this is such a lightweight fabric, it tends to want to not grab it when I'm first starting, and it also kind of makes sure that I'm not distorting it when I'm sewing for the stretch part. Okay, so now we have our little lace t-shirt, kind of nightgown. It's looking pretty cute. So like here, we're going to pull this little thread tail. Let's get rid of this one here. We're going to pull it into the seam allowance just like this. I'm going to use an awl to kind of hold those stitches there. And I pull them pretty snug without distorting the fabric edge, the hem edge. And then I'm going to trim it, all these little threads now pretty close, now that they're secure. And then I'm going to also fold the seam one direction and stitch it down so that it's nice and flush down there at the bottom of the hem. It'll hang a little nicer. This side was a little funky because of that weird scallop. All right, so I'm going to hem my neckline, and the last thing I suggest is maybe putting something at the center back neck so you can kind of determine the back from the front really easily, especially on these garments that on lace like this, it's hard to even tell if it's right side out sometimes, and then again you can kind of see through it, so it's kind of hard to determine the front from the back. And you can do something like just put a ribbon loop hanging down from the neck. I've even done really small things where I've done a little triangle like this and just kind of sewn it in so that it's flush with the neck edge like that. You could even, maybe just use like one of these daisies and stitch it on, maybe on the outside, on the back. That would be kind of nice. A piece of bias is really soft, it's washable, and it doesn't unravel. Any little thing. I've even used a stitch marker that you use in knitting. I have really small knit stitch markers that are rings, and you can't even feel them when you're wearing them. So I just sewed it in with a few stitches of thread. So that can work as well, and those are washable as well. So I'm going to pick a little piece of ribbon here. It's kind of pre-sewed. This velvet ribbon is really soft, and luckily I have a piece that almost matches. Let's find the center. All right, so for this little hem, I'm going to do a pretty narrow rolled hem, as narrow as I can do. And I'm going to start at the shoulder seam. I feel like that's always the best place to start a hem around the neck, or anywhere that there is a prominent visible front or back. I like putting my back stitch right here. You might find that some feed dogs are kind of grabby on your lace, so just be really careful. And you might even find a smoother presser foot as well. All right, and you'll notice I didn't stretch it. You might need to a little to be able to get some of those curves hemmed with whatever your curve, if it's pretty steep or something. But that was pretty easy. And once I press it, it'll be nice and relaxed. And if you're worried about sewing knits with a straight stitch machine, you can check out my video on is a serger really necessary? it is in a lot of cases, but it always isn't, and I use it quite often. I use my single needle quite often. This is pretty nice. My ribbon's really the bulkiest thing there, but it turned out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So let's see it on the dress form, shall we? Well, she turned out pretty cute. Quite pleased with that. That worked really well. It was a really fast project to sew. And I think, you know, with the stretch and the knit, very easy to fit. You could even make lace shirts to wear under things as like a camisole or maybe peeking out of another shirt. So I think this is a really nice, quick little project. I've got my scalloped hems. The neckline looks really good. I haven't even pressed it yet. So nice job, eh? All right. Well, I hope you enjoy this and you can make yourself a nice little stretch lace number as well.